Well, okay. Welcome, everybody. And yeah, nice to be here. This week I am beaming in from a hotel room in Winnipeg. I've just been here speaking at Manitoba Watershed Conference and for the last couple of days. And so I beam in here from a different location today for the final session. And yeah, as Kate mentioned, we're going to touch on soil erosion. Now, for those of you that did watch the previous sessions and that have tuned in, really we had these three themes: soil health, soil compaction, and soil erosion. And, you know, they are very, very much intertwined, one and the same thing. And so we've kind of focused, on those kind of the broad discussions on soil health and the role of roots and building soil organic matter, driving soil biology. And really is also central to improving then alleviating soil compaction, tightness of soil, opening up that soil, improving the structure. And really, when you do that, when you prevent that compaction and improve the soil structure, well, also you are minimizing the issue of soil erosion. It is soil compaction that often leads to soil erosion, and soil compaction, of course, stems back to just poor soil health. So these three topics are very much interrelated, and we're going to put the last piece of the puzzle into the jigsaw tonight to focus on this erosion. And as you'll see as we move through, there's a lot of commonalities, there's a lot of common themes that very much interlink these three topics. So, okay, let's dive into it. So in the context then of soil erosion, really we're talking about, what is it? I mean, you all know it's that removal of soil. And in terms of the cause, it's typically caused from primarily with, water would be the big culprit here. But of course, certainly on the prairie context, those winds can also be incredibly damaging once we get that soil blowing, the soil blow, and those very fine soil particles that are the lightest, that is so easily removed in the wind and the water for that matter. And these very fine particles are actually often among the most fertile parts of the soil. The smaller the particle, the higher the surface area, the more fertility it has in many regards. So when we also talk about soil erosion, it's usually the most fertile part of the soil that's getting blown away or washed away first and foremost. Now, beyond water and wind, of course, we have things like ice, glacial activity, etc., and then all of these things working also in concert with gravity, particularly on slopes, where thanks to gravity, the soil particles will move down the landscape as well. And really then, we have to, unfortunately, be honest that agriculture, as much as it is a solution to a lot of problems out there, it is also a cause of a lot of problems. And there's no doubt about it that this issue of soil erosion is certainly exacerbated and accelerated by various human activities, and agriculture is a big one. And it's not to say that agriculture should be the cause of these issues. With good agricultural management, we really can avoid soil erosion as well. So it's not to say that agriculture is so central, but it can be both a problem and it can be both also the solution. So it's just about how we do agriculture. Same as animals, we love to blame livestock for a lot of problems, and it's about how we manage the livestock that's much more important. So, but nonetheless, let's be honest too, erosion is a natural process. It's not to say that it's a unique experience caused by humans. Soil erosion is a natural process, and on some level we could argue that it is supposed to happen. It's just really what we're really, the nuance of this discussion is really talking about the speed or the rate of that soil erosion. Perhaps that's much more so the problem of concern. But okay, agriculture, a big piece of this puzzle, grazing animals, and then of course some of these other areas like logging, you're all aware, of course, mining, even the construction industry, and even in a recreational context. So, many of these human-related activities ultimately expose the bare soil. And once we've exposed bare soil, we are just highly, highly prone, highly vulnerable to that soil than blowing or washing. And I showed this image in one of our earlier presentations. And, once that soil starts moving, especially on a slope, as it moves down the landscape, down the slope, this is, so quick, this resource, this precious resource that we often talk about, soil and soil health and how important it is to food production, feeding ourselves, etc. But once that same resource, just in a different location, off the field, now down in the waterways, into the rivers, nutrients leaching down into the groundwaters, etc., that how quickly the same precious material can become also such a pollutant. And it's really just about that moving soil. So we have to keep soil where it is. And it's going to be all about those plants and plant roots that are so key in stabilizing soil and keeping the soil where it is. And really then this problem of soil erosion specifically, it does start a lot at the surface. What's happening at the surface is a big piece of this discussion. And it is when, as you can see here, when we see surface sealing or crusting, where the soil surface basically seals off is where we have critical problems. Because once the water cannot penetrate down, it cannot infiltrate down into the soil, if it has nowhere to go, it can't go down, or the speed of it going down is too slow, based on the speed of the rainfall, of more water being added, it has nowhere to go. It can only go across. It can only go horizontal. And so this problem of surface sealing and surface crusting is really central to the problem of soil erosion. If we can improve the surface of the soil, the quality of the surface to prevent this sealing, then we open up that opportunity for infiltration. And as soon as we do that, we minimize the potential of this horizontal movement of water. So it's really about, you can see this nice kind of crop, again, the seal or this crusting that you can kind of see. It's the very, very fine particles that after the impact of raindrops that I'll show in a second, that some of those various surface fine particles, they begin to disperse and they kind of interlock and form this very nice kind of layer of almost like cement that you can kind of also witness here. So this is the problem that we're referring to, and really it really is all about how we manage the soil surface. Because if we prevent the sealing, then we open that window for infiltration, and therefore minimize the problem. And it does start. Rain is a big part of this equation. As those raindrops fall, we might think of them as a harmless little raindrop, but actually, in the splash that you can kind of see here, it's not just water that's getting splashed up there. If we maybe had a better color image, you would see that really the water that's splashing here would have brown sediment in it. There's lots of fine soil particles in that splash. And you can kind of, see an essence of the shadow of the effect of that here, but you bet there'd be soil particles that are after the impact of that rainfall that are being dislodged. And it's those displacement of those fine particles that then begin to accumulate and resettle on the surface that ultimately leads to this fine seal crusting that you can kind of see back there. And really, that really opens the door to the problem of erosion. It's the raindrops, it's those particles moving, and as they then move and splash and resettle, they're either going to seal on flatland, or you've dislodged and loosened up the soil particles where we have a slope, and then you're going to be seeing those very fine particles wash away. And as I mentioned, it's the fine particles of soil that are the most fertile. It's because they're very small, have very high surface area, have a high ability to bind to nutrients, bind to moisture, and improve the moisture and nutrient holding capacity of the soil. And those very fine elements are the fine particles are the ones most easily lost through the wind or through the water, for example. Now, as the picture here also depicts, if we just have some surface protection, a litter layer, just have the soil protected with either litter residues or with living roots, with living plants and their leaves that will catch the rainfall first, and then those leaves will funnel the water down much more slowly and permeate that down into the soil, and avoiding this issue of the raindrop impact and the splash. That living cover with living roots and living leaves that will catch that water, or surface mulch, as we can see here, it completely protects and cushions and protects that soil surface from those raindrops that would otherwise cause much more hard impact. So, and therefore damage. So it opens up that point from in the cropping world to emphasize the importance of litter, of surface litter and surface protection. And of course, in the pasture and grazing world, you're lucky you have perennials already growing. So you have living roots and you have living cover. Again, what's key is grazing management and how avoiding overgrazing, obviously, to then expose too much of that bare soil, which can then open up the opportunity for those raindrops to cause damage. So ultimately preventing then this soil sealing. Definitely, we want to minimize tillage, minimize soil disturbances. This disturbance can also trigger some of those fine particles to accumulate and kind of re-cement back together. And as I just pointed out there earlier, residue retention. This is just a huge part of this discussion. Just let the mulch cushion the impact of the raindrops, and 90% of your work is done. Of course, longer-term strategies, building soil organic matter, especially at the surface. So the use of things like manures, compost, cover crops, any way in which we can build soil organic matter, build the soil carbon levels. That more soil organic matter adds to the resistance of the soil against the impact of those raindrops. The raindrops have much less splattering effect. When we have good soil organic matter, even within the soil, we have better structural conditioning to prevent those fine sediments kind of being splashed around from the raindrop. And so, of course, this comes also then down to living cover, living roots, and having good dense root systems. The more roots you have growing into the soil and through the soil, the more that soil is just held in place by the roots. And it's much harder for the soil to wash away if we have dense root systems penetrating through that soil and locking it into place. So again, choosing appropriate plant species, deep-rooted plant species, maybe deep-rooted varieties also, and just making sure we keep living roots and plants with deep root systems growing as part of the system within the agricultural system for soil stabilization. And then I'll say a few words on calcium management. And this is also an important piece of the puzzle. Soils that are very low in calcium are more prone to also to soil erosion. And that's because calcium has a very beneficial effect on the soil physical properties. We often, of course, talk about calcium in the sense of liming materials to address soil pH, to address the acidity of the soil, for example. But actually, calcium plays an equally important role and influence on the physical structure of the soil. And that really comes down to this thing called flocculation, this process of flocculation. Calcium, as a nutrient, it has a 2+ charge, which means it's being a plus charge. This means it's called a cation. And being 2 means it kind of has like 2 hands. It has 2 positive charges. And that very fact basically means that it has 2 arms, 2 positive charges to hold on to soil particles and what's called flocculate them, open them apart, kind of bring them together and stabilize them. And this happens because soil particles, they are negatively charged. So soils, colloids, clays, etc., are negatively charged. The nutrients are positively charged. So we have an attraction. And so what calcium does is through the 2 arms, the 2+ charge, it grabs onto the soil particles and pulls them in and kind of stabilizes them. And by pulling them and flocculating them kind of together in a nice structure, it creates these flocculates, these little beginnings, these micro aggregates. This is a chemical attraction to the positive negative charge, and it creates an electrical attraction where we form these little micro aggregates. We're pulling the soil particles together, but holding them open at the same time. So we're bringing them together, but also holding them open, and particularly creating, again, pore space. We talked a little bit about pore space and porosity last week, and creating the opportunity then through that pore space for the water, for that infiltration. Infiltration is key. If we want to prevent the horizontal movement of water, erosion, we have to ensure penetration, infiltration down. We have to ensure vertical movement of water down into the soil. And so from a chemistry point of view, calcium is a very important amendment, things like lime or gypsum, which can be used to supply that calcium to provide a nutrient that draws the soil particles together, flocculates them together, and holds them tight, holds them well or equally in an open kind of structure, which enables gaseous exchange as well, oxygen to come in, carbon dioxide to come out, but also water infiltration. And as soon as we have, say, soils that are very low in calcium, and we see this, for example, with soils that are often quite high in sodium, also high in potassium, as you can see that both sodium and potassium, they have only a 1+ charge. So they are not as strong as calcium that has 2+ charge, 2 arms to hold the particles and stabilize. Sodium only has 1 arm. And so that means it doesn't bind as tightly and it cannot stabilize. Sodium is more dispersive of soil particles. It can't hold the 2 together and bring them together. It can only hold 1. And unfortunately, this leads to more of a breakdown in soil structure. It disperses the soil particles. They become more repellent. They don't attract to each other into these aggregates. They are repelled. So we have a breakdown of soil structure, what's called soil dispersiveness. And when the particles then disperse, and that's exactly what we saw earlier with this kind of surface sealing and the crusting, where we then get water pooling and ponding on the surface, and then ultimately it will move horizontally. So by addressing calcium limitations in the soil, overcoming things like excess sodium or potassium, bringing calcium up really helps to improve the structure of the soil. It's not just about using calcium for soil pH, it's also about using it for the structural benefits. So in terms of then preventing erosion, there's a pretty easy kind of list of things we can do. Certainly one, just keep the soil covered. As soon as we have bare soil, you're asking for trouble. So keeping the soil covered, and that could be mulch, litter residues, or living plants, living roots, as we touched on also a bit in the last lectures. So definitely keep the soil covered is number one. Minimizing soil disturbances where possible, avoiding overgrazing. As mentioned, give pastures a nice long recovery. Don't kind of graze them too close together, kind of tight grazing again and again and again. Give them a long period of time for recovery, for good biomass production, both above and below the ground. Okay, maybe on steep slopes, doing things like terracing or that kind of those kind of structural kind of engineering kind of strategies. Buffer strips for sure, planting kind of near waterways, planting buffer strips, sections of permanent perennial cover to just capture any soil erosion that may, if we do see some soil erosion, just having protection there to prevent that erosion from ultimately washing into the rivers. So buffer strips near waterways, for example, is also a very useful way to just to help to alleviate the issue. And really then living roots, that links back to this keep the soil covered. We can do it with mulch, with residue, or with living roots. And perennials have a huge advantage of being perennials, therefore they are permanently in the ground. It's not an annual crop that's start, stop, therefore opening the soil to bear, to kind of opening up the kind of opportunity of bare soil, therefore more prone to erosion. So perennials have a lot of advantages. They just keep that permanent cover. And then even if not within annual systems, sure, can we establish cover crops after harvest, or can we use more companion cropping where we could have understory plants growing with cash crops, that after cash crop harvest, we have these understory companions who then provide that cover later on through the winter time. And even managing winter cash crops, winter wheat, for example, at least we can establish that in the autumn, in the fall, and have at least some soil cover during the winter season. And that's really, I think I found this random picture, I just think it was highly appropriate. It really captures the essence of this. Honestly, wherever you have plants growing in soil, the soil is stabilized. Roots are not just great for helping the plant get nutrients out of the soil. Roots are the key stabilizers of soil. It is the way those roots branch and penetrate and grab onto soil, which ultimately stabilizes the soil. So this is the number one to prevent soil erosion. Just keep the soil covered. Living mulch, litter, fine. Living roots, even better, because you've got plants that are photosynthesizing, capturing sunlight, pumping root exudates down into the soil, and feeding the soil biology. So you're keeping the soil health more active. You're keeping the soil biology more functioning, because as those plants are growing, they are photosynthesizing, they are excreting these sugars, carbohydrates, amino acids, proteins down into the soil, these root exudates you can see here. And those compounds are feeding the soil biology, feeding the organisms. And it is then those organisms who are also releasing all sorts of gluey, sticky type substances that also facilitate this role of soil sticking and soil stabilization. And so we also looked at this image earlier in one of the other presentations. It's just to say that, yes, plants release a lot of these various root exudates, some of which for nutrient solubilization, nutrient capture, but some are to feed the organisms. And when the plant feeds those organisms, those organisms are, yes, also releasing nutrients, but they are also growing and dying, and their dead bodies becoming kind of sticky. They also release these gluey type substances, which ultimately all help to pull soil particles together and improve aggregation, and therefore soil stability, and therefore minimize that potential of erosions. Again, I'm pretty sure I showed this picture in one of the other slides as well, the other presentation as well. Just, you can see it there, keeping the soil covered where we have roots, all of those leaves captured the sun, any rain, and then slowly funneled it down to the surface where it could slowly penetrate, infiltrate down through the root channels. Here, where we have no living roots, we have now water ponding, puddling on the surface, just asking to ultimately for that to build up if it was a heavier rainfall event, and then we'd see that water start running and taking soil sediments with it. So just, again, a really stark visual example of the value of living roots and living cover. There's kind of one of those buffer strips that I mentioned. So these are called prairie strips. These are very relevant as we get close to the waterways, having these permanent perennial lines. And you can see another one up here, where if soil did end up washing, if sediment was washing, nutrients were leaching through, like, we're going to have permanent perennial roots and protection there to capture that, stabilize that, and prevent it from moving onwards into the waterways. And, some of these kind of buffer strips can be beyond just their goal of capturing nutrients or sediments. They can also perform other wonderful ecosystem services, like this beautiful Phacelia here in bloom. As I'm sure many of you know, bees absolutely love Phacelia. So we have a strip here that is capturing potential, protecting the soil, capturing potential nutrient losses, but at the same time providing flowers, pollen, habitat for beneficial insects. And it's just indeed a win-win. Another photo here, again, looking at the importance of these roots and the root stabilization. You can see how well the soil is sticking to the roots. And this is a sign that all those root exudates are pumping out, feeding the organisms. All of those bacteria and fungi are releasing those gluey type substances, those biotic glues that ultimately help to stick the soil particles together and onto the roots. And we see wonderful soil stabilization that is happening right here through the formation of these dreadlocks here that are called rhizosheaths, stabilizing the soil particles. And we also talked about perennials. Wherever you can have perennials in the system, on the left-hand side, you can see they just have deeper roots. So all of that soil is stabilized, plus you have all of that cover on the surface that is going to capture those raindrops, prevent that wind, block the wind, capture the raindrops, prevent that splashing on the surface so that you won't even see that surface erosion. But then we have all these root channels and tunnels. And remember, those roots are growing and dying, they're turning over, and therefore we're creating channels, tunnels for the water to infiltrate down into the soil surface. So again, it's this perennial cover, and it's about the roots that provide much of the structural benefit that enhances the infiltration. And the quicker we can infiltrate water, the less chance it's going to move horizontally and cause erosion. Now, we also have, I talked a little bit there about calcium and this process of calcium pulling the soil particles together, flocculating the soil, and forming these little micro aggregates. And really these micro aggregates at that chemical kind of level where that nutrient is beginning to pull and stabilize the soil particles, this is a micro aggregate. And what we see is that then the influence of the biology, the living components of soil, be that, yeah, sure, the plant roots might start to grow through some of these soil particles and nudge them together, pull them together a little bit. But we also then have the organisms of the soil, the bacteria releasing these gluey substances, fungi growing in long kind of strands or threads that again pull particles together, and little soil insects and earthworms who are also channeling and tunneling. And as they kind of tunnel through, they're pushing soil particles closer together and kind of facilitating this aggregation process, aggregating soil particles together to form now not just micro aggregates, but to form larger macro aggregates. So the micro aggregation really happens at that chemical level with the nutrients, the calcium, for example, and then the bigger organisms start to interact with those soil particles, pulling lots of those little micro aggregates together into these larger macro aggregates. And that's really what we're seeing is it's dependent on really, again, photosynthesis and food, the roots, the carbon, the root exudates, feeding these organisms and really triggering the organisms to start to take these dispersed soil particles and bring them together. It's just start to glue and stick them together into these kind of aggregate type formations, which ultimately more and more of those aggregates get stuck together to form these bigger macro aggregates, as you can kind of see. It's really just all those same small particles that are compressed in a way that is not too tight, but compressed, that creates these aggregate structures, which are hotspots actually for microbial growth and carbon stabilization. And when we aggregate soil particles like this, we also create pore space in between. And just to say that when we aggregate soil particles into these macro aggregates, they're not permanent either. Aggregates, they are also being turned over. They are formed and then they are recycled, broken down, and they are reformed and recycled. So aggregates do also destabilize over time. They don't live forever. They're also kind of broken down as a big root might move through and push everything apart, and then it will reform and re-aggregate that process. So it is very much a cyclical process. And here we're looking at a nice image of real nice little aggregates. As you can see, clumped soil particles together, and in between that we have pore space. You can see this looks like cottage cheese. It's crumb structured, it's like textured, it's not flat and smooth. We have dark space, we have depth, we have a three-dimensional structure, porosity that is evident there. And that's really what we want to see. It's about aggregating the particles and then creating the pore space in between. Here's a nice, again, a nice visual example of an aggregate. And again, I did mention this slide earlier as well. Again, these are very relevant topics to all three of these themes. Just I mentioned the importance of not just about soil structure and the aggregation, but we talked about this one in the context of how important the porosity of the soil. Yes, it's about pulling soil particles together, but with that, we create porosity. We create space in between the particles. And it is that porosity, the size of those pores, how well those pores are connected. It is that space in between the particles that actually drives so many of the important functions that we're talking about from soil health point of view, but also certainly from an erosion point of view. And in terms of then helping to pull soil particles together, yes, central to this, as I've touched on just there, is the role of roots, plants, roots, and root exudates in feeding the biology and helping them to kind of stick and glue the particles together. But if we just dive a notch layer deeper into this, it is specifically mycorrhizal fungi who play a very important role in this process. And this, I'm quoting a study here from quite a few years ago that looked at, it was a long-term study that really looked at a range of different variables that influence soil structure and soil aggregation. And they tried to say, okay, well, which of these is the most important? Of all the things that we know that improve soil structure, which is the most highly correlated with good aggregation, good structure, which of these variables? And what they found is that a highly significant correlation with mycorrhizal fungi. This is arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the presence of these fungal organisms. And that's because fungi grow in these long strands or threads. And as those threads penetrate through the soil, they're continually pulling those soil particles together. And mycorrhizal fungi are unique in that they produce a very specific exudate, a microbial metabolite, a very gluey substance called glomalin. And this glomalin is very sticky. It's very stable as a source of carbon in the soil. It's very stable itself, but in particular, it's very sticky. So it helps to stick these soil particles together and stabilize them into these aggregates. So they found that wherever you have highest levels of mycorrhizal colonization, you'll have highest levels of aggregates. And if you have good levels of aggregates, then you have good pore by default. You're going to have good pore space, good porosity. And it is that porosity that brings so much of the important benefits. And they found that soils that have a history of cultivation, of course, it breaks apart those aggregates, breaks apart those fungal hyphae. And they also found that in soils with a heavy history of fungicide use, of course, fungicides are used to control fungal diseases, but they can also have negative offside effects on the beneficial fungi as well. So therefore, compromising mycorrhizal fungi, and therefore reducing the activity of that fungus, therefore reducing the activity of that glomalin sticky compound, and therefore lowering the strength and stability of the various aggregates. So this is really just a nice image depicting this transition from micro to macro aggregates, as we kind of just explained. If we take this macro aggregate here, here's again these strands and threads, fungal hyphae that we were kind of talking about, all sorts of various ones penetrating into this ball, into the sphere, and gluing it together. But if we just kind of zoom in specifically into one portion of this larger macro aggregate and zoom into here, here's the circle here that correlates with here, we can see that we get much finer. We have some root activity through here. As we're zooming in, we see now more of the soil particles. And again, if we just zoom in really even deeper level to these soil particles, here we have our macro and then micro aggregate. And if we really zoom right in, it's these are the primary particles, the clays, the sands, the silts, the negatively charged surfaces that are reacting, for example, with that calcium. And if we have lots of calcium saturated on these soil particles, well, that's helping to keep those stable, open, flocculated, so that then the biological interactions beyond at the microchemical level, we move into these biological interactions to form these larger macro aggregates. And really, this is just saying the same thing. Yes, part of this is a mineral, a chemistry interaction, but as you can see, it's really the fungal and bacterial activity. These are the biological aggregation strategies, the roots, the root activity, and the larger organisms like those insects and earthworms. Soil macro aggregation is very much a biological process. Sure, chemistry plays a bit of a role at the beginning, but these larger macro aggregates are very driven by biological interactions, bacteria and fungi, roots, and some of those larger organisms. And that's just really pointing out the role of this gluey kind of strategy to glue soil particles together. And then just to close on this section, to say that also, how can we then encourage mycorrhizal fungi? And one of the best strategies to support this fungi in the soil, to help them make those aggregates that stabilize soil and prevent erosion, is plant species diversity. I'll share two quick studies that support this, but there's really a lot of good evidence that shows that the more diverse we can have our plant stand, that with greater diversity of those root systems, of different root exudates, that feeds the fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, and that supports them, keeps them active, helps them forming that glomalin, sticking the soil particles together and improving soil structure. So just to highlight that it's one of the best strategies we can do to support this fungi and therefore prevent erosion is more plant species diversity. And here we have one study looking at the effect of plant diversity, 1, 2, 8, or 16 species, and how they influence mycorrhizal activity. And they found that the 16 species plots produced 30 to 150% more spores and from 40 to 70% greater spore volume than mycorrhiza in the one species plots. So more diversity equals more mycorrhizal fungal activity. Another study is showing the exact same thing in terms of mycorrhizal infectivity or mycorrhizal colonization, as well as glomalin production. So here we're looking at a native grassland, looking at mycorrhizal infectivity and the production of glomalin. Again, 1, 2, 8, or 16 plant species. And they showed that the glomalin production and the mycorrhizal infection were lowest in the monocultures and were more closely correlated with plant diversity than with just plant cover. So it's specifically the diversity that was really helping. Spore density was also greater in those higher diversity plots. So in terms of coming back to the study here to say that, yes, they found that the strongest predictor of good aggregation and good structure was the presence of these mycorrhizal fungi. And then the key to really supporting good mycorrhizal activity in soils is plant diversity. Keep the soil, don't disturb the soil, and maximize the plant species diversity. And you will encourage good mycorrhizal populations, and they will build those aggregates for you and create the pore space to let the water in so that the water doesn't travel across, ultimately leading to soil erosion. Okay. Let's take a couple of questions if there's any.
Thanks, Joel. And yeah, feel free to send a message in the chat or unmute your mic if you'd like. Not seeing anything. You might be off the hook tonight.
That's right, yeah. Feel free to ask if anyone has anything.
Okay, well, I guess if there's no questions, then we can wrap it up here. So thanks again, Joel, so much for being our speaker for this 3-part series. And I hope everyone enjoyed and learned a lot. There's so much good information. Again, this recording will be up on the YouTube page, so you can refer to all 3 of the videos if you'd like. And other than that, I hope everyone has a great night and stays warm. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.